Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And I'll extend my thanks as well for attending the webinar this afternoon. I appreciate your company as I go through this talk this afternoon about implementing and validating a CDS. A little background on myself, as Brenda mentioned, my name is John Zank. I'm the Validation Services Director here at CSols. I've been with CSols now for 5 years. However, my background, I've had about just over 20 years in the industry doing computer systems validation, and that'd be across mainly GLP and GMP, but also more specifically working with large pharma companies, CROs, biopharmaceuticals. I've done a bit of network and infrastructure qualification along the way. And through my career, I've been involved with the Society of Quality Assurance with the Computer Validation Initiative Committee, and then was also able to be a contributing author to a document around 2000 that was released that dealt with computerized systems in non-clinical area dealing with validation and compliance. So as the agenda for the presentation this afternoon, what I'd like to do is start off with just kind of level setting, getting some assumptions set up there that will hopefully lay out the foundation for the presentation. And then as we move through, what I've done is tried to break this up into things to consider along the arc or the arch of a program of a validation process. So talk a little bit about things to consider along the way with starting at a starting point, talking then about during the scope of implementation, a little bit about instrumentation and personnel, talk about the deliverables that are typical with implementing and validating a CDS, provide some scenarios, and then just a quick wrap up at the end. And as Brenda mentioned, if you have questions, comments, go ahead and submit those, and leave some time at the end. I can come back around and try to answer those for you as well. So when I talk about assumptions, there's 4 main ones to lay the groundwork or the foundation for the rest of the talk. So the first one being that I'm making the assumption that you or your company, anyone that you've been involved with in your company, have already decided on a chromatography system that works best for your lab. This is what that means is I'm not going to spend time going into the different chromatography systems in their specific functions or functionality. There's Open Lab, Agilent, Open Lab CDS, or Chromeleon, or Waters and Power. So whether you've decided on one of the top tier systems or another one, I'm not going to spend too much time going into details on those. Also, the assumption that you have other laboratory software solutions that you're using in your lab, and they may or may not be validated, but most chromatography systems, and I'll touch on it a little bit in terms of things to consider, but they can and do interface with other systems, but really the focus of this is mainly on the chromatography aspect of your program. And then assumption that you're operating in a regulated environment, which requires software validation. The reason I'm making that assumption is I'm not going to go into detail. I do touch on deliverables, as mentioned in the agenda, so I will discuss some things to consider surrounding deliverables, how that impacts your implementation and validation, but I'm not going to go into, the purpose of this is not to go into a lesson in software validation in particular. And then the last assumption is you have some standard software validation guidelines, policies, and procedures. Kind of ties in a bit with the previous one, in that I will discuss some standard deliverables, but again, not going into the depth of the purpose of them. All of these assumptions, as Brenda mentioned, if you're interested to learn more, just in general, CSols, we have other webinars that deal with these topics. and we can also provide more information on them, just not within the scope in depth of this presentation. So let's talk about a starting point for your CDS implementation and validation project. And really, I've broken this down into two starting points. This slide deals with looking at it if it's your first chromatography implementation. And then the next slide, which I'll get to, goes into a little bit more about things to consider about when you're upgrading or going from an existing CDS to a different CDS. So if this is your first implementation, a lot of these really can apply to any type of first system implementation. But these are 4 critical areas that we found when we worked on these projects in the industry. So first, probably the big one, when you're working with chromatography systems and you're working with the vendor, supplier of the software, do you understand what that vendor is providing versus what you're responsible for having? In general, the general rule of thumb in a regulated laboratory space in particular is that the end user, the owner of the system, is ultimately responsible for the use of that system. So you will be required to defend it and understand how it works, how you use it, everything that goes, surrounds that. So looking at when you're starting out a project up front in a planning phase, make sure you take some time to understand what the vendor will provide in terms of documentation for their system, evidence of their testing. Will they provide configuration support? Will they provide infrastructure support? Just getting a good understanding of where the vendor comes from and what's left for you to defend. It's critical to when you're starting out a project. And I talked about infrastructure. Another thing to consider is, have you assessed your infrastructure? And what I mean by that is, and I'll touch on it a little bit more when I get to instrumentation portion of it. But obviously, if you're looking at implementing a enterprise version of a CDS or using it across multiple sites, multiple labs, do you know if you have the infrastructure set up to do that, or do you need to purchase things like server space? Are you going to host it, or is it going to be hosted? Is it cloud? Or are you going to use Citrix for remote access? So take some time up front and understand what infrastructure you need to have in order to make it most successful for you to use. When we talk about staff, and I'll talk about personnel in a little bit more detail as well later on, but when you're starting the project, do you know if you have any staff already that already have experience with the system, especially if it's a first-time implementation and you're going from paper to electronic? If you have anybody internally on your staff that has either used different CDS or have used CDS in general in the past, that can be very helpful to providing insight to how to implement the system, and especially when it comes to things like training or developing documentation. So knowing up front before you get, a good way into the project, kind of what experience level you have will help you understand how you need to staff your project team. And then probably one of the big things right now, big topics with data integrity in the industry, is, have you taken the time to identify what are electronic records versus paper records? Again, there's nothing wrong with having a hybrid system where some records are electronic, some are paper. So that's not an issue. But what you really need to focus on and consider is understanding what you're going to rely on as electronic versus paper, because that will drive how you do the validation to the extent of data integrity. So what you need to protect within the system when it comes to audit trails, editing, basic security, versus how to link any of those electronic records to your paper records. So sometimes it's easy to say, well, we're going from paper to electronic, so everything's going to be electronic. And if you don't take the time up front to understand what can and can't be, then you might run into it down the road when you start getting into the testing aspect, or looking into it a little closer and realize that maybe some things you do need to keep on paper. So making that assessment and looking into that up front is critical. So let's say you're looking at the other starting point of transitioning from another CDS. And you can kind of throw into this the category or the scenario rather of going from CDS system A to system B, or going from CDS system A.1 to A.2, right? In both of those cases, you're transitioning. So in general, all the considerations that discussed during the first time implementation, those still apply. So critical to understand, assess your infrastructure. Do you have people that are familiar with whatever system you're going to? Are you going to keep the same electronic records that you used in the last system? Will the new system have different functionality where you can now eliminate some of the paper records? So still keep all those first considerations in mind.